in the autumn of 1851, within a narrow depression of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina. 31 children from a single one-room schoolhouse walked through a ridge gap on a clear Tuesday morning, and were never again seen in that manner. 6 days afterward, 4 emerged from the forest, barefoot and silent, their hair turned white at the temples. The remaining 27 have stayed, in some official capacity or another, missing for 175 years. What the county ledger recorded as a weather-related mishap, what the church recorded as an act of providence, and what the 4 survivors would not discuss until the final one died in a state asylum in 1928, combines into a story the county itself attempted to bury on 3 distinct occasions. The marker that formerly stood at the entrance of that hollow was taken down in 1889. The schoolhouse was destroyed by fire in 1902. The land was sold and resold until no living soul in the valley could indicate where the children had vanished. Before we proceed with the account of Ashcombe Hollow, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. And in the comments, share with us which state or country you are tuning in from tonight, because what you are about to hear was recorded in a diary that a granddaughter gave to a historian in 1971, and what that diary held has never been read aloud before. To grasp what occurred on the morning of October 21st, 1851, you must first understand the location. When the settlement of Ashcombe lay nestled in a fold of the Blue Ridge, roughly 30 miles west of the nearest proper town, which at that time was Morganton. It was not a town in any sense that would be recognized nowadays. It was a scattered grouping of perhaps 40 farmhouses, a single Presbyterian meeting hall that served as the schoolhouse on weekdays, a blacksmith, a gristmill on Pigeon Creek, and a general store operated by a widow named Prudence Halsey. The inhabitants there were of Scots, Irish, and German descent. Most were second or third generation from families who had traveled down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania in the 1780s. They cultivated tobacco and corn in the lowlands, kept hogs in the forest, and distilled a thin whiskey that the revenue officers had not yet found reason to pursue up the ridges. The winters were harsh, with drifts in the high passes, sometimes closing the road to Morganton for weeks on end. The summers were lush and humid, the air so dense with moisture that laundry hung at dawn would remain damp at dusk. The people were, according to every surviving account, devout, wary of strangers, and holders of lengthy memories. They did not overlook offenses. They did not neglect debts. And they did not forget, though they did not frequently speak of it, the matters that the elders had been told by those before them about the land that lay above the creek. The hollow itself, the one the children entered, sat perhaps a mile and a quarter east of the meeting hall, along a path that followed the north bank of Pigeon Creek and then angled south between 2 ridges. It was labeled, on the sole surviving county survey map from 1847, as Ashcombe Hollow, after the first family that had established itself in the valley. By 1851, it was more frequently referred to by the older name, which the original settlers had taken from a Cherokee word they had imperfectly learned, and which meant, as best as anyone could translate, the place where the ground remembers. The Cherokee themselves had been driven from that region in 1838 during the removal, and whatever understanding of the land they had left behind passed to the settlers as fragments of caution. Children were not to go up that hollow after dark. Hunters avoided it in the late autumn. Women did not go there to collect galax or moss, though the shaded coves along the creek yielded both in abundance. A man named Josiah Veach, who had established the farm nearest the hollow's mouth in 1821, had nailed a wooden cross to a beech tree at the path's entrance in 1829, and had informed his neighbors it was to mark the boundary of a particular kind of land. though he would never specify what kind. When pressed, which was infrequent, he would only state that a man who had sold him the South 40 in 1824, an older German named Hagenbeck, who had been in the valley since 1798, had pointed to the beech tree on the day of the sale and said, in the fragmented English of his old age, "You do not cross this mark at dusk, and you do not send a child across it alone. Not for any reason, not for any price." Hagenbeck had died in the winter of 1827, without further explanation. Veitch had waited 2 years before erecting the cross, and he had put it up, he said, on a night when the wind from the hollow had roused him for the 3rd time in a fortnight, and he could no longer tolerate lying in his own bed and listening to it any longer. The school teacher in Ashcombe that year was a young woman named Evangeline Trout. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a Methodist circuit rider from Salisbury, and she had come to the settlement in the spring of 1850 under a 1-year contract that had been renewed in the spring of 1851 for a 2nd year at a salary of $90 per annum, paid half in coin and half in the produce of the valley. She was slender, fair-haired, and according to the descriptions left in 2 separate letters written by her contemporaries, possessed of a quiet authority that surprised the older men of the settlement. She did not, unlike her predecessor, defer to the fathers of her older pupils. She did not, unlike the itinerant preachers who passed through, soften her speech for the benefit of the deacons. She was, one of the Ravenel men wrote to his brother in Charlotte, an educated woman in the way that makes a mountain man uneasy, which is to say she knew things he did not, and she did not pretend otherwise. She boarded with the Halsey widow in the small upper room above the store. She was engaged, by correspondence, to a young seminarian named Cornelius Bream, who was studying at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey, and she kept a small leather diary, which she filled in most evenings by the light of a tallow candle in the room above the store. It is this diary, preserved by accident in the bottom of a trunk, passed down 3 generations, and finally surrendered to a graduate student at Chapel Hill in 1971, that forms the central document of what we know about what happened. The children she taught numbered 33 in the census she had taken in September of 1851. They ranged in age from 6 to 14. The oldest was a boy named Absalom Ravenel, the son of a tenant farmer, a tall, quiet, 14-year-old who was said to read the King James Bible aloud to his younger sisters in the evenings, with a steadiness of voice that astonished visitors. The youngest was a girl named Comfort Pettigrew, who had turned 6 only in August, and who had come to the school, according to Miss Trout's diary, clutching a small rag doll she had named Susanna, and which she would not put down even during her lessons, until the older girls persuaded her that Susanna was tired and wanted to sleep in her lap. Among the others were 2 sets of twins, and the Eakin girls, Mercy and Prudence, aged 11, and the Stroop boys, Cullen and Cassius, aged 9, and a pair of cousins called the Trask boys, Phineas, who was 8, and Elihu, who was 10. There was a girl named Verity Pellegrin, who stammered, and whom Miss Trout had been teaching to read separately after the school day ended. There was a boy named Thaddeus Orr, who was 9, and who had, his mother recorded later, a fear of water so severe that he would not wade the creek to reach the schoolhouse on wet mornings, but would instead take the long road around by the footbridge. There was a girl named Patience Thibodeau, who was the daughter of a cobbler, and who had, in September, won a ribbon at the county fair for her stitching. On the morning of the 21st, 2 children were absent. Cullen Stroop was home with a fever. Patience Thibodeau had been kept back by her mother to help with the last of the apple pressing. That left 31 children in the meeting hall when Miss Trout rang the small brass bell at 700 and began the day's lessons. The decision to take them into the hollow was hers, and she recorded the reason for it in her diary 3 days earlier, on the 18th. A traveling naturalist, a man named Dr. Emmerich Kohl, a Bavarian by birth, and for the past 12 years a professor of botany at a small college in Ohio, had passed through the settlement on the 15th and had lodged with the Halsey widow for 2 nights on his way back east. He had spoken at supper about a rare plant, a species of orchid which the old Cherokee had called by a name he could not pronounce, which bloomed in late October in shaded coves in the Blue Ridge, and which he believed, on the basis of certain specimens he had collected in the Smokies the previous year, could be found in the vicinity of Ashcombe. He had shown Miss Trude a small pressed specimen from his portfolio. It was, she wrote, the most curious flower she had ever seen. Greenish, white and veined with a dark purple that looked black in candlelight, with petals that had an almost lipped quality. As though the plant had been designed, she wrote, to speak. She had been, her diary records, enchanted. She had decided that a walk with the children, to gather the last of the autumn leaves and, perhaps, to find the orchid, would serve as a natural philosophy lesson worth more than a week of reading from the primer. She chose the hollow because it was the nearest cove with the deep shade and wet ground that Dr. Kohl had described. She did not, so far as the diary records in the entries up to the 18th, know about the cross on the beech tree. She did not know about the old Cherokee name. She did not know about Hagen Beck or about Josiah Veitch's sleepless nights. If anyone in the settlement knew of her plan and could have warned her, no one did. The Halsey widow, interviewed 4 months later by the school teacher's fiancé, said she had assumed Miss Trude intended to take the children only as far as the beech tree at the mouth of the hollow, where the orchids were, she thought, just as likely to grow. When she realized, she said, that the girl had meant to go further into the clearing where the spring came up, and it was already dusk on the 21st, and by then there was nothing to be done. The weather that morning was clear and cold, the sort of late October morning in the southern Appalachians, when the first hard frost has fallen in the low places and the leaves on the maples and the hickories are at their highest color. There was frost in the shadows, but the sun was out, a thin yellow sun that gave light without much warmth. The children, when Miss Trude announced the walk after the morning prayer, "If you please, children," were said by the survivors who lived long enough to be interviewed to have been wildly happy. "We shall go fishing." They were given leave to run ahead on the path. They were told to stay within earshot. They carried small cloth bundles with their midday bread and apples tied at the corners and slung over their shoulders with twine. Miss Trude walked at the rear with the 2 oldest girls, Mercy Eakin and a 13-year-old named Constance Halliard. The path ran along the creek, crossed it once on a foot log, and turned south into the hollow at about 1800 of the clock. By 900, they had passed Josiah Veitch's cornfield, where Veitch himself was pulling the last of the ears, and who raised his hand to Miss Trude as she passed, and who did not, he said later, think at the time to ask her how far she meant to go. By 9:15, they had passed the beech tree with a cross. And here the diary, kept by Miss Trude herself, goes silent for 6 days. The alarm was not raised in the settlement until nearly dusk. Widow Halsey, expecting her boarder back for the afternoon recitations at 2 of the clock, had assumed at first that the naturalist walk had run long, and that Miss Trude had perhaps decided to let the children eat their bread at the spring, and had lost track of the hour. By 3, she was uneasy. She walked to the meeting hall and found it empty. She walked to the edge of the settlement and looked up the path toward the hollow, and saw nothing. By 4, she had sent a boy to fetch Josiah Veach. Veach, pulling corn in his field, said he had seen the children go up the path that morning, but had not seen them come back. He climbed onto his mule and rode up the hollow himself, calling. The hollow returned his voice in the flat way that cubs sometimes do, which is to say, not as an echo, but as a muffling, and no voice answered. He rode as far as the clearing at the spring, and saw, he said later, in only the small cloth bundles folded on the flat rock and the cores of several apples scattered on the moss. And he did not stay. He was a grown man and a Presbyterian, and not given, he would say when pressed, to fancies. But there was a feeling in that clearing, he said, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff in the dark. And he turned his mule and rode out at a pace that was faster than he meant, and he did not look back. By full dark there were 15 men with lanterns and 2 hounds working the paths. By midnight there were 40. By the morning of the 22nd, the entire settlement had emptied itself into the woods, and riders had gone to Morganton to fetch the sheriff. Women stayed in the meeting hall and prayed. The blacksmith, a man named Wilkin Mulder, did not fire his forge for 6 days. The gristmill stopped turning. The general store opened only for flour and salt. The Reverend Obadiah Ashcombe, who was 63 years old and walked with a cane, walked with the rest up the hollow and sat on a log at the edge of the clearing for the whole of the 22nd and the 23rd, and did not speak to anyone. He wrote later in his letter to his bishop that he had sat there because he had believed at first that if he prayed without ceasing, a sign would be given to him as to where the children had gone. He wrote that no sign was given. He wrote that in the late afternoon of the 23rd, he had heard what he took to be a child laughing somewhere to the east up the slope, and that he had risen and called out, and that the laughing had stopped, and that no child had appeared, and that he had sat down again, and had wept for the first time since his wife's death in 1839. What the search parties found, or rather what they did not find, was recorded in 3 separate accounts. A report was filed by Sheriff Cassian Verlander on the 27th of October. A letter was written by the Reverend Ashcombe, grandson of the first settler, to his bishop in Raleigh on the 29th, and a longer manuscript was written years later by the school teacher's fiance, Cornelius Bream, who traveled from Princeton when the news reached him and stayed in the settlement for nearly 4 months attempting to understand. All 3 accounts agree on the following. The children had gone perhaps 3/24 of a mile up the hollow. They had stopped in a small clearing, perhaps a half-acre in size, and where a spring came up through mossy stones. There were signs that they had stopped there. Apple cores, cloth bundles left folded on a flat rock, their corners neatly tied, as if their owners had intended to retrieve them shortly. A small pair of pattens set neatly side by side, as if their owner had sat down to rest and slipped them off. A ribbon, pale blue, of the sort that was commonly used to tie a girl's hair. A slate pencil, unbroken. From that clearing, no further signs were found. No trail led out. The ground, though damp in places, showed no prints leading away. The hounds would not enter the clearing. 2 of the dogs, the sheriff's report notes with some embarrassment, lay down at the edge of it, and would not be coaxed forward. And one of them whined and bit the man who tried to drag it across the line of the spring. While the search continued for 11 days, men walked the ridges in pairs and in threes. They beat the laurel thickets with sticks. They fired muskets at intervals to signal each other. They walked the creek for 2 miles in both directions. They found a bent hickory branch that might or might not have been broken by a passing child. They found, in a cleft of rock about 400 yd east of the clearing, what one of the searchers, a man named Ephraim Kirst, described as a neat pile of small stones, 11 stones, stacked as a child might stack them, which had not been there when the settlement's last hunt had passed through that cleft in early September. Cursed, who had lost a daughter of 10 in the walk, dismantled the stack with his hands. What he did not tell the rest of the party, and what his wife only learned from him on his deathbed in 1878, was that beneath the stack he had found a single braid of brown hair tied with a piece of red wool, and that the braid was his daughter's, and that he had taken it home and burned it in the fire on that same night, because he could not bear, he told his wife, to let the others know. Let this sink in for a moment. 31 children and a grown woman had walked into a half-acre clearing 3/24 of a mile from a settlement of 40 families, and they had simply stopped being there. No blood, no clothing, no disturbance of the ground. The spring flowed as it always had. The leaves lay where they had fallen. If you are finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a second to let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And if you are new here, subscribe so you do not miss the second half of this. Because what happened on the 6th day is what the settlement spent the next 50 years trying to forget. The settlement grieved in the particular way that isolated mountain communities grieve. There was no weeping in the streets. There were no bells rung. The women cooked and carried the cooked food to the houses of the families who had lost children, and the men sat on the porches and did not speak. A prayer meeting was held on the evening of the 24th, at which the Reverend Ashcombe read from the Book of Lamentations, and the families of the missing children did not attend. Not one. The Ravenels did not come. The Pettigrews did not come. The Eakins did not come. The Trasks did not come. It was said by a woman named Mehitable Cross, who lived 2 farms over from the Ravenels, that Thomasina Ravenel sat on her front step all day on the 25th and would not go in, and would not eat, and would not speak except to say, once, when her husband tried to take her inside, that she was waiting because a mother knew when a child was coming. And a child was coming. By the 26th, the search had been scaled back to a few men walking the ridges in pairs. By the 27th, it had effectively ended. Sheriff Verlander rode back to Morganton. The settlement, the Reverend wrote in his letter, was a place where no one looked each other in the eye, because to meet another's eye was to see there the same empty place that one carried in oneself. On the morning of the 27th, at about 6:15, a woman named Sibby Larkin, who was hauling water from the creek, saw movement on the far bank. The fog was heavy that morning, she said later. So heavy that she could not see the other side of the creek until she was almost in the water. She set down her buckets and walked closer. 4 children were standing in the shallows, in water up to their knees, facing upstream. They did not move when she called to them. She waded in. The creek cold enough that she could feel it through her boots, and took the nearest by the arm, and it was a boy named Thaddeus Orr who was 9 years old, and he did not look at her. His hair, which had been brown, was white at the temples. The other 3 were a girl of 11 named Mercy Aiken, a boy of 8 named Phineas Trask, and the oldest, Absalom Ravenel, who was 14 and who was missing 2 of his front teeth, which had been in his mouth on the morning of the 21st. Sibby Larkin carried and led them up to the settlement, and there was, she said later, no resistance in any of them. They were neither cold nor warm. They did not shiver. They did not cry. Their feet, which were bare, showed no cuts from the stones of the creek bed. Their clothes were the clothes they had gone up the hollow in 6 days before, and the clothes were clean as though they had been laundered and pressed and put back on. It was this last detail, Sibby Larkin said later, that she would remember until her own death in 1894. The clothes were clean. After 6 days missing in the woods, the clothes were clean. The four were separated and placed in 4 different houses under the care of their own families, where their families had survived to take them. The Ravenels had both of Absalom's parents. The Trasks had Phineas's mother, his father having died of dysentery in 1847. Mercy Aiken was placed with her parents and her 4 surviving siblings, though her twin Prudence was not among the returned. Thaddeus Orr was placed with his father, his mother having been carried off by childbed fever in 1845. Doctors were sent for. The nearest doctor was in Morganton and did not arrive until the 29th. In the intervening 2 days, the children did not speak. They ate when food was put in front of them, slowly without apparent appetite. They slept when they were led to bed. They would walk where they were walked. They did not respond to their own names. They did not respond to the names of their siblings or parents. When Thomasina Ravenel sat with Absalom and held his hand and wept and asked him repeatedly where the others had gone, young Absalom looked at the wall and did not answer. And when at last, at the end of a long afternoon, he turned his head toward her, she said later that she had wished immediately that he had not, because his eyes were not his eyes, and whatever was looking out of them was not her son. And she had known in that moment, she said, that her son was not coming back, no matter how long she waited on the step. When the doctor arrived, a man named Percival Cleave, who had trained at the University of Pennsylvania, and who had been chosen for this call specifically because he had a reputation in the eastern counties for unusual cases. He examined them one by one. His notes, which survive in the archives of the North Carolina Medical Society, because he thought the case important enough to write up for a paper. He never finished and never published. I describe 4 children in perfect physical health. No bruises, no wounds, no sign of exposure or starvation. Their weight was consistent with what their family said they had weighed at the start of the month. Their clothes were the clothes they had worn on the morning of the 21st, unchanged, not even soiled. Their hair at the temples had gone white in a band about an inch wide on each side, as if painted on. Their eyes, he wrote, tracked light but not faces. Their pulses were slow, in Absalom Ravenel's case, remarkably slow, 52 beats per minute, which in a boy of 14 he considered abnormal. They did not blink at a bright lamp held near their faces. They did not respond to the sudden discharge of a pistol fired by his assistant in the next room, which he had arranged without telling the families, a test he afterward regretted. They were not, he wrote, catatonic in any clinical sense he recognized. They were somewhere else. That was the phrase he used in his notes. They were somewhere else. And whatever had taken them, there had sent back in each of their bodies something that did not entirely know how to be a child. Over the following weeks, 3 of the 4 began, in varying degrees, to return. The little boy, Phineas Trask, who was 8, was the first. He began to respond to his mother on the 11th of November, 21 days after his return. She was sitting beside his bed. His mother wrote in a letter to her sister in Rowan County, and she was singing a hymn she had sung to him when he was an infant, the one about the Lord being her shepherd. And he turned his head and he said, quite clearly, "Mama." And then he began to cry. And he cried. His mother wrote for 3 hours, and she held him, and she cried also. And when he was done crying, he slept. And when he woke the next morning, he knew her again, and he knew his own name, and he knew the day of the week, which she had told him. But he did not know what month it was, and he did not know why his father was not there. And he did not know, his mother wrote, that he had ever gone up the hollow at all. He seemed to believe, when she pieced it together from his questions, that it was still the summer. He seemed to believe he had been ill. By December, he was speaking in short sentences. By spring, he was attending a dame school in Morganton, to which his parents had moved, for his mother had married again in February to a carpenter named Lemuel Quince, who had agreed to take the boy on, and he was, by outward measure, a normal child, though he would not sleep in a room without a lamp, and he would not eat apples, and he would not, under any persuasion, walk east of the house in which he lived, because east, his stepfather noticed, was the direction in which the mountains lay. Mercy Eakin came back more slowly. She began to speak in March. She was withdrawn, her family said, and she would stand for long minutes at the window, looking up the valley. And she had a habit of asking, at odd moments, whether the singing had stopped. No one in the house knew what she meant by the singing, and she would not explain. "Why won't you speak?" And when her mother pressed her in April and asked her directly whether she was speaking of the hymns the family sang at evening prayer, Mercy shook her once and said, "No, the other singing, the one that keeps on," and when then she would not speak for the rest of that day. She was the only one of the returned who spoke, however obliquely, of what had been in the hollow. Her mother, who kept a daybook, recorded 7 separate instances over the following 3 years in which Mercy referred to something she called the singing. In each case, Mercy used the definite article, as though the singing were a known thing between them, which her mother said was what unnerved her most. The assumption on the child's part that her mother also knew. Mercy married a farmer named Cyrus Palmore in 1859 and bore 4 children and lived to the age of 71. She spoke of the incident to no one else, not even her husband, until the last week of her life, when she said only one thing, which her daughter Patience recorded in the family Bible, which was, "We could not keep up with the others, and they went on without us, and we were the ones who fell behind, and I do not know if that was a kindness or a curse." Thaddeus Orr came back in pieces. He spoke in May, a word at a time, mostly words for objects he saw in the room. By June he was constructing sentences. In August, without warning, he stopped speaking, and he did not speak again until the following spring. When he resumed, he seemed at first to be a normal 11-year-old. He attended school. He helped his father in the fields. He was seen in the summer of 1853 laughing with another boy on the road outside the store. But in the autumn of that year, on the anniversary of the walk, he went into long silence that lasted through the winter. And this pattern, his father wrote, became the shape of his life thereafter. In the autumn, he did not speak, and he did not, it seemed, hear what was said to him. In the springs and summers, he was nearly as he had been before. His mother wrote in a letter to her sister sent, that first fall after his partial recovery, that he was 2 boys, the one who had gone up the hollow, and the one who had come back, and that neither of them was entirely hers. He never married. He worked as a field hand on his father's farm until his father's death in 1868. He was committed to a state asylum in 1871 at the age of 29 after an incident in which he had walked in an autumn silence 10 miles east from his farm toward the old settlement of Ashcombe, which had by then been mostly abandoned, and had been found sitting at the mouth of the hollow with his hands on the beech tree that had once held the cross, and which had by then fallen. He died at the asylum in 1889. Absalom Ravenel, the oldest, never came back at all. He did not speak. He did not respond to his name. He did not, in the opinion of Dr. Cleve or the 3 other doctors who examined him over the next 12 years, suffer from any identifiable disease. His appetite was good. His sleep was regular. His vital signs were stable. He simply did not engage. He lived in an upper room of his parents' house for the rest of their lives. And his mother, Thomasina, cared for him as though he were an infant, dressing him, bathing him, reading to him from the Bible in the evenings, though he gave no sign that he heard the words. His father could not bear to look at him, and ate his meals in the kitchen and slept on a cot in the barn from 1854 onward. When they both died within a month of each other in the influenza outbreak of 1863, he was taken in by his uncle Barak Ravenel, and when Barak died in 1871, he was committed to the state sanitarium at Morganton. He lived there for 57 more years. He was known to the staff as the Silent Man. He ate what was put in front of him. He walked in the yard when he was walked. He did not speak. He did not write, though a succession of doctors over the decades tried to teach him to hold a pencil. He did not draw. He did not acknowledge, by any sign the staff could detect, that any person existed in the world beside himself. He did not appear to see a mirror when one was held in front of him. He did not startle at loud sounds. The only thing he was known to do, which was recorded in the ward journals over 57 years, was this: on the 21st of October of each year, between the hours of 300 and 500 in the afternoon, he would stand at the window of his room, whichever window he had been given that year, and he would face east. He would stand for precisely 2 hours. At 500, he would turn and sit on his bed, and he would resume his usual silence. He did this every year from 1871 to 1927. He died on the 3rd of February 1928 at the age of 91. He was, at the time of his death, the oldest living patient in the sanitarium. The day nurse who was with him, a woman named Imogen Darnell, wrote in the ward journal that at 6 minutes past 300 in the afternoon, the Silent Man opened his eyes, which had been closed since morning, and said, in a perfectly clear voice, 3 words. He said, "They are coming." Then he closed his eyes and died. What had happened in the clearing? Understand that this question consumed the settlement for a generation. It consumed the school teacher's fiance, Cornelius Bream, who interviewed every adult in the settlement during the winter of 1851 and 1852, and who left behind a manuscript of some 400 pages unpublished, now in the rare books collection at the University of North Carolina. It consumed the Reverend Ashcombe, who preached an annual sermon on the anniversary of the disappearance until his death in 1868, each year pressing his congregation to examine themselves for the sin that had, he believed, drawn down the judgment, though he never could name what the sin had been. It consumed Dr. Cleve, who returned to the settlement 3 times over the following 20 years to examine Thaddeus Orr and Absalom Wevenel, and who died in 1881 with a drawer full of notes he had never been able to organize into a paper. It consumed Josiah Veach, who went mad slowly over the course of the 1850s and who was found hanging in his barn in the spring of 1861, with a note pinned to his shirt that read only, "I should have cut down the tree. I should have cut it down in 1830. Forgive me." And it has consumed in quieter ways every historian and folklorist who has come across the case since. The Diary of Evangeline Truitt, when it surfaced in 1971, was believed by the graduate student who received it to be the final answer. It was not. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the record in Ashburn deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves forgotten American history. Hit the like button to help us grow and subscribe so you do not miss the parts of this that almost never left the archives. Because what the graduate student found, and what he would not publish, and what he eventually burned, has only one surviving copy, and that copy sat in a box in a retired professor's garage in Durham until 2019, when his daughter sold the contents of the garage at an estate sale and a local historian bought the box for the 12. Here is what was in the diary. Evangeline Truitt had written in it every night from the 17th of March, 1850, when she arrived in the settlement, until the night of the 20th of October, 1851. The early entries are what one would expect from a young woman in her first post. Observations about her pupils and small loneliness. Letters written to Cornelius and not yet answered. Descriptions of the weather. Reflections on the sermons she had heard at the meeting hall on Sundays. In the summer of 1851, the entries begin to record her walks. She had taken, it seems, to walking alone on Saturday afternoons for the exercise, and she wrote, to clear her head of the week's noise. She walked the path along the creek. She walked the ridge to the north. She walked, beginning in August, up the hollow. The first entry in which she mentions the hollow is dated the 9th of August. She writes that she had gone only as far as the beech tree with a cross, that she had been curious about the cross, and that she had asked the Halsey widow about it on her return, and had been told that it was an old mark, and that Veitch had put it there, and that its meaning had been forgotten. Miss Trout notes, with the mild condescension of a young educated woman for a rural superstition, that she supposes the cross was meant to ward off some fancy of the older generation, and that it is a pity the settlement cannot see its way to clearing out such reminders of a less enlightened time. On the 16th of August, she records her first walk past the beech tree up to the clearing at the spring. She writes that it is a beautiful place, that the light comes down through the high leaves in columns, that the spring water is so cold it aches the teeth, and that she sat for nearly an hour on the flat rock beside it. She writes that she heard, as she sat, a sound which she took at first for the wind, but which, when she listened more carefully, resolved itself into something like voices, as though a group of people were speaking at a considerable distance, just below the threshold of comprehension. She writes that she was not frightened. She writes that she assumed there were farmers working somewhere beyond the ridge, that the cove was acting as a sounding chamber, and that she was picking up their talk carried on the air. She writes that she walked home in good spirits and slept soundly. On the 23rd of August, she returns. The sound is there again. She writes now that she is beginning to doubt her earlier explanation. The sound does not have the rhythm of conversation. It has, she writes, the rhythm of singing, though no tune she can place. It rises and falls. There are what she takes to be words, though she cannot quite make them out. She stays longer this time, perhaps 2 hours. She writes that when she leaves the clearing, she feels a strong desire to stay, and that for several hundred yards down the path, she has the sensation that she has forgotten something important and ought to go back. The entries through September record further walks, increasing in frequency. By the middle of September, she is going up the hollow 3 times a week after school. Before the light fails, she writes less about it than one might expect. She begins to describe the sound as the music of the cove, and later as the singing, and by the end of the month simply as it, with the familiarity of a private language. She writes on the 29th of September, May, that she believes the sound to be a natural phenomenon of some kind, perhaps related to the flow of water through rock, but that she would like to consult a man of science about it. She does not yet know that Dr. Cole will appear in the settlement 2 weeks later. There's no turning back. On the 6th of October, she takes the first 2 children with her. This is what the graduate student noticed and what the school teacher's fiancé, who never saw the later pages of the diary, never knew. If we hope to see the spring she had taken the children before. On the 6th of October, she took Absalom Ravenel and Mercy Aiken, the 2 oldest in her school, and she took them, she wrote, because she wanted to know whether the singing, as she now permanently called it, was audible to others. She wrote that she had begun to fear she was imagining it. She wrote that she wished to test the matter scientifically. She took the 2 children up the hollow on a Saturday afternoon, led them to the clearing, and asked them to sit on the flat rock and tell her what they heard. They heard it. Both of them heard it. Mercy, she wrote, was at first unsettled and asked if they could leave. But Absalom was fascinated. Absalom sat on the rock for a full hour and listened, and when at last they began to walk back down the path, he asked, in a voice Miss Trout described as dreamy, whether they might come again. She agreed. They came again on the 13th. This time Miss Trout brought 4 children, Absalom and Mercy and 2 others, a boy named Gideon Pettigrew, who was 10, and a girl named Verity Pellegrin, who was 12 and who stammered. She writes that Gideon heard the singing immediately and laughed, and that Verity heard it also and did not laugh. Verity, she writes, asked a question which Miss Trout had not expected. Verity asked whether the singers were inside the rock. Miss Trout, not knowing how to answer, said that the sound was only an echo, that it had a natural explanation, and that there was nothing to fear. Verity, who normally stammered, spoke that day in the clearing. Miss Trout wrote, without any stammer at all, and asked her second question, which was, if they are not inside the rock, then where are they? Miss Trout does not record her answer. She records only that they stayed another quarter of an hour, and that she had to take Verity by the hand and lead her out, and that she had to promise Verity that they would come back, because Verity would not otherwise move. On the 20th, the night before the walk, she writes the entry that the graduate student would, 37 years later, recognize as the center of the whole mystery. I will read it now exactly as it was written, without editing, so that you may hear it, as she wrote it at 11:30 on the night before the last morning of her life. I have been 3 times in the clearing at the spring, and 3 times I have heard the singing, and I cannot tell whether it is the singing of children or of something that is learned to sound like children. Dr. Cole asked me on the evening of the 16th whether I had heard anything unusual in the hollow on my walks, and when I said yes, he did not seem surprised. Mo, he said, there were places on the ridge where the rock lay in a formation he called resonant, and where the wind and the water and the cavities beneath produced, at certain hours and in certain seasons, a sound which uneducated persons mistook for voices. He said the old Cherokee had known these places and had marked them, and that their traditions about them were no more than the natural tendency of the human mind to personify what it cannot explain. He said there was no harm in them, provided one did not go at dusk. The ear is less reliable, and the imagination more. I asked him whether he had ever been such a place, and he said he had not. That he was a man of science, and that he preferred to read about them. I did not tell him I'd already taken children into the hollow twice, before on Saturday afternoons, because I wished them to hear what I had heard. I did not tell him that on the second Saturday, Absalom Ravenel had said to me after we had been in the clearing for perhaps a quarter of an hour that the singing had words in it, that the words were asking the children to come closer, but only the children, and that the voice would nod to me, because I was too old. I did not tell him that little Verity Pellegrin had said without her usual stammer that the voices were behind the spring and not above it, and that they were beneath the stones, and that they were, she said, lonely. I did not tell him that when we left that afternoon 2 of the younger children had not wanted to leave, and that I had had to carry Gideon Pettigrew out. I did not tell Dr. Cole any of this because I was, I confess, unashamed to admit that I'd taken children up the hollow without the permission of their parents. And I was aware that to confess it would invite reproach. I have decided I will take them tomorrow, all of them together, as a school outing sanctioned by the committee, so that we may hear it as a class and discuss what it is. For I am convinced that Dr. Cole is correct, and that the sound has a natural cause, and that the children's fancies about it will dissolve in the light of understanding. I am certain this is the right course. I am writing this at 11:30, and I will try to sleep. There is a wind in the eaves tonight, and for a moment I thought I heard the singing again. Though we are 1.25 miles from the hollow, which is of course impossible. That is the final entry, though the diary continues with blank pages for the remainder of the book. Miss Trout was, as has been said, never seen again. Her body was never recovered. Her fiancé, Cornelius Bream, in his long manuscript, records that her boarding room was left exactly as she had left it on the morning of the 21st. That her bed was made, that her hairbrush and her small mirror were on the washstand, and that the diary lay open on the table beside the candle. Open not to the entry for the 20th, but to the entry for the 16th of August, the day of her first walk to the spring. He does not explain why the diary was open to that page. He does not explain why the candle had been allowed to burn down to nothing. When Miss Trout's habit, which the Halsey widow confirmed, was always to snuff it before leaving the room in the morning. The diary itself, after his return east in March of 1852, was sent to the Halsey widow, who kept it in the bottom of the trunk in which she stored her winter quilts. She gave it on her death in 1868 to her niece, who gave it to her daughter, who gave it in 1971, after cleaning out her mother's house, to a graduate student at Chapel Hill named Hollister Vance, who was at that time researching antebellum education in the Southern Appalachians, and who had written to the daughter asking whether the family possessed any documents from her great-aunt's school. What Hollister Vance understood when he read the diary, and what he confirmed by traveling to the site himself in the spring of 1972 with a geologist colleague from the university, was the following. There is in that hollow, in the clearing where the spring comes up, a formation of limestone beneath the surface, which contains a series of narrow fissures. When the wind is from the north, and the creek is running full, and the pressure of the air is falling before a front, those fissures do produce a sound. The sound is continuous, soft, and pitched in a range that the human ear, particularly the ear of a child, whose hearing extends further into the upper frequencies than an adult's, interprets as voices in the middle distance. In certain weather, it resembles singing. In other weather, it resembles conversation. In still other weather, it resembles the thin crying of infants. The geologist recorded the sound with the microphones he had brought and played it back for Vance in a motel room in Morganton that evening. And then Vance wrote in his notes that when he closed his eyes and listened to the recording, he could almost believe the sound contained his own name. It is, as Dr. Cole said, a natural phenomenon. It occurs in several locations in the Southern Appalachians. It is not by itself dangerous. But Vance also discovered something else. He found in the records of the settlement, preserved in the county courthouse at Morganton, that there had been previous disappearances, not on the scale of 1851, but disappearances all the same. A hunter named Lemuel Gaither had vanished in the hollow in 1814. 2 children, siblings named Isham and Dorcas Coggan, had gone missing from a farm at the of the hollow in 1833, and had been found a week later, silent and uncommunicative, and had both died within a year. A traveling peddler named Ezra Mace had disappeared in 1844, and his abandoned cart had been found at the beech tree with the cross. The horses still in their traces, the peddler's ledger book open on the driver's seat to an entry for the 15th of September, 1844, that was never completed. A mill hand named Caradoc Swain had vanished in 1829, the year Veitch put up the cross. A pair of brothers, the Orchards, had gone up the hollow hunting turkey in 1801, and only one had returned. And the one who returned had hanged himself 3 weeks later. Vance compiled a list of 17 separate incidents in the hollow between 1789 and 1850. The pattern, he noted, was not random. The incidents clustered in the late autumn. They clustered in years following wet summers. And they clustered, most disturbingly, them in years in which the population of the settlement had increased, as though the hollow were responding to pressure or to opportunity. Vance also found, in the Cherokee ethnographic records held at the Smithsonian, a reference to the place which translates, not as the place where the ground remembers, but more precisely as the place that keeps what it takes. He found a Cherokee prohibition, recorded by an ethnographer named James Mooney in 1889, against bringing children to the clearing under any circumstances, and specifically against bringing them in numbers greater than 1. The ethnographer had not understood the specificity of the prohibition and had dismissed it as a local superstition. Vance, with a diary in front of him, understood the specificity exactly. 1 child at a time. The tradition said, never more. Miss Trout had brought 2 on the 6th of October. She had brought 4 on the 13th. She had brought 31 on the 21st. Vance came to believe, and this is where his dissertation advisor, a professor named Lanford Tremaine, warned him against publication, that the sound in the clearing was not the cause of the disappearances. It was the lure, something else in that place, something that he did not name in his notes, because he could not find a name for it, used the sound to draw prey in, and the prey it preferred. The tradition implied and the pattern confirmed was children. The evidence for his interpretation was circumstantial. It was based on the Cherokee prohibition, on the pattern of disappearances, on the condition of the 4 returned children, and on the testimony of Absalom Ravenel's mother, that whatever looked out of her son's eyes was not her son. And on one further piece of evidence, which he found in the state sanitarium records when he obtained permission to examine them in 1974. That piece of evidence changed everything. He found that on the afternoon of the 3rd of February, 1928, at the precise minute that Absalom Ravenel spoke his last 3 words and died, a patient in a ward on the other side of the building, a woman named Orpha Quill, who had been committed for hysterical melancholia in 1917, and who was 63 years old at the time of her death, had also died. Her death certificate listed natural causes. The ward journal for her ward, however, recorded that she had died in exactly the same manner as Absalom, that she had been silent and unresponsive for her entire decade at the sanitarium, and that at 300 in the afternoon on the 3rd of February, she had opened her eyes and had said in a clear voice 3 words. The same 3 words. They are coming. And had closed her eyes and died. Vance traced her history back. She had been committed in 1917 from a boarding house in Asheville, where she had been living alone under the name Orpha Quill for 24 years. She had appeared in Asheville in 1893. The boarding housekeeper had said she had come up the mountain road on foot, alone, dressed in the fragments of a child's pinafore. Though she was by then a woman of 48, she had not been able to give her name. The name Orpha Quill was one the boarding housekeeper had chosen for her, in order to have something to write in the ledger. She had carried when she arrived a single small object, which the boarding housekeeper kept with her effects until her commitment. It was a pressed flower. It was a greenish, white orchid veined with dark purple that looked black in candlelight. It was a species that did not grow in North Carolina and had never been cataloged by any botanist. It was the flower doctor, Emmerich Cole had shown Miss Trout in the upper room of the Halsey store on the evening of the 15th of October, 1851. Vance traced the woman's history back further. He traced it through features on her death photograph. He traced it through dental records the sanitarium had kept. He traced it, finally, through the shape of a small birthmark on her left wrist, which had been noted by the admitting doctor in 1917, and which matched precisely a birthmark described in Evangeline Trout's diary, in an entry from the spring of 1851, in which Miss Trout had described her youngest pupil, a girl named Comfort Pettigrew, who had been 6 years old on the morning of the 21st of October, and whose rag doll named Susanna had been found 4 days into the search on the flat rock beside the spring, where she had left it when she had walked further into the clearing than any of the others had walked. Orpha Quill had been Comfort Pettigrew. She had walked into the hollow at the age of 6 in 1851, and she had walked out of it at the age of 48 in 1893, 42 years later, carrying a flower that had not existed in the world. And then she had lived for another 35 years in silence, and she had died at the precise moment that Absalom Ravenel had died, and she had spoken his same last words. Vance's manuscript ends there. He did not know what to do with what he had found. He wrote in a private letter to his advisor, which Tremaine kept, and which was in the garage box that was sold in 2019, that he felt he was looking through a window into something that should not be looked at, and that he had begun to dream on the nights after he read the sanitarium records of a clearing he had visited only once. He burned the manuscript in 1978. The copy that survived, the one bought in the estate sale in 2019, is a carbon duplicate he had made in 1976 for his advisor and had forgotten about. The historian who bought it, a woman named Marta Wexler of the State Archives, has not published it either. She has, she said when I contacted her in the summer of 2024. No intention of ever doing so. She believes, as Vance came to believe, that the clearing is still there. She believes that the spring still runs. She believes that in the right weather, the fishers still sing. And she believes, though she will not say exactly why, that the other 27 children who walked into the hollow in 1851 are still, in some sense that she does not wish to articulate, unaccounted for. She has been to the site once. She will not go again. One final detail, and with it we come to the end of what can be known. In 2006, a hiker on the Appalachian Trail, which passes within about 3 miles of what was once Ashcombe Hollow, there reported to a park ranger that he had become disoriented in a fog and had wandered off trail and had come upon a small clearing with a spring in it, perhaps half an acre in size. He had, he said, heard what he took to be children singing, though he could see no children, and he had sat on a flat rock beside the spring for what he believed was about 15 minutes listening, trying to locate the source. When he had finally risen and found his way back to the trail, 2 groups of other hikers had passed him on their way north, and each of them, when he had asked, had told him a different date. When he reached the ranger station at the end of that day, he learned that 4 days had passed since he had stepped off the trail. He had no memory of where he had been during those days. He had in his pack a small pressed flower, greenish-white and veined with a dark purple, that looked almost black in certain light, which he did not remember picking. The ranger took the flower, promised to send it to a botanist for identification, and filed the report. The flower was never identified. The ranger retired in 2011. The report is in a filing cabinet in the ranger station. The hiker's hair went white at the temples in the following year. He lives in Ohio. He does not return phone calls. This mystery shows us that the past does not always stay buried, and that some places are best left unvisited, not because they are haunted in any fashion the old stories would recognize, but because the ground itself, the geology, and the weather, and the deep time of the mountains may be indifferent to us in ways we cannot fully understand, or because what the mountains hold, whatever it is, or has its own hunger, its own patience, and its own slow measure of years. 4 children walked out of that hollow in 1851. 27 did not. 1 returned 42 years later, changed beyond recognition, carrying a flower that should not have existed. And in a small private cemetery in western North Carolina, there is, to this day, a marker with no name on it, only a date, October 21st, 1851, and the single word "lost," which a descendant of the Ashcombe family paid to have erected in 1951, exactly 100 years after the walk, because she felt that someone ought to remember what the county had 3 times tried to forget. She told the stonemason who told his apprentice, who told a local reporter, who wrote it down in a notebook that was never published, that she had been haunted all her life by a feeling she could not name. A feeling that came to her strongest in the late autumn. A feeling as though somewhere just below the threshold, told of hearing a group of voices were singing and were calling her by name and were asking her to come closer. Only the children, they said. Only the children. But she had never been a child again since the day she had learned the story. And so she was safe, she said, from whatever it was. And she hoped that by raising the stone, she might somehow discharge the debt that her family and her county and her country owed to those 27 who had gone and had never come back. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the graduate student Hollister Vance was right about what lived in that clearing? Or do you believe the whole affair has a simpler, sadder explanation? A teacher who meant well. A geological curiosity. A community that could not bear the weight of what it had failed to prevent. And a woman who wandered out of the mountains half a lifetime later with a flower in her hand and a silence in her throat that no doctor could open. Leave your comment below and tell us what you think truly happened in Ashcombe Hollow.